This is Austin Liddy Limits, where authors talk to authors about books and the craft of storytelling. Sponsored by Blue Ink Review, because typing the end is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com. Antoine Wilson is a Canadian-American novelist and short story writer. He was born in Montreal, Quebec, and now lives in Southern California. Not only is Antoine a notable writer, beginning to end in our normal style, he began keeping a journal in his 20s where he became adept at writing backwards on the page. Mouth to Mouth is his third novel.
So welcome to the show, Antoine Wilson.
Thanks, Scott. Nice to see you.
Excellent. It's nice to see you. I'm very excited to talk to you about your book. I know it's been out for a little bit, but I just had a chance recently to read it. Mouth to Mouth is a fantastic story. And I recently saw an interview with Yiyun Lee and yourself around the book came out. And I mean, how great it is you got to talk to her. She's a great storyteller herself. Now that a lot of time has kind of passed since the book came out, what do you think that you take away from the success of it? Was there anything that surprised you about the publication of your book and how it was kind of interpreted by readers and other writers?
Yeah, there were a few surprises. I think the number one initial surprise came just before publication. The New York Times put it in their gift guide. The book came out, I think, in January, and the gift guide was in December. So, and it was in a sort of roundup of mysteries and thrillers. And so that was a huge surprise to me that I had written something that could be considered a mystery or a thriller.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't feel to me like a genre book. There's some intrigue. There are questions as to the reliability of Jeff, who's talking to our narrator. And there's a death, questionable death, things like that. But I didn't seek out, I didn't seek to write a thriller. And so I thought, okay, well, this is good. I mean, maybe more people will read it than if it's, contemplating my navel or, middle-aged white guy writes third novel, So I think,
Right.
it brought some people to the book. But then I also worried that people who have certain genre expectations from reading a lot of mysteries and thrillers might pick this up and go, this is two guys sitting in an airport talking. What's happening here?
Mm-hmm.
And then the second surprise that still comes up sometimes in book clubs is occasionally people think that my narrator is female.
Oh.
Yeah. And, not default, right? And there's a
Okay.
picture of me on the book and so on. But first person narrator, there's a line in there about stepping away from carpool and groceries and living the life that people imagine writers live every day or something like that. And it's the carpool and groceries line that make people think that my narrator's female, along with the way that the narrator describes Jeff in college as attractive, which I don't know, a male might not say about another male or something, but
that's very interesting.
That was surprising to me. Yeah. And then subsequent to that, it's just interesting to imagine, like, what if I had intended that, right? And then it's like these people just very openly read this book as if this was a female interlocutor.
Do you feel that besides that description, is because the narrator doesn't have a name, that then they just kind of project onto the narrator that it's just a nameless?
Yeah. It definitely could be. I mean, usually if I read a book with a nameless narrator, I assume it's an authorial stand-in, and then, I go with the gender of the author, but.
Right.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I mean, to me, I go grocery shopping and I used to take my kids to school, so that's not uncommon for me, but that is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's definitely not uncommon for me. I mean, I'm not that narrator. I fall asleep on airplanes just fine, but he doesn't. But besides that, yeah, I did take from life a lot of
Mhm.
things from that narrator. Yeah.
That's very fascinating. So the story is it's two men that meet in the airport, like you said, they're old acquaintances from college. Didn't really know each other too well, but they knew of each other. Probably like friends that are satellites in a group. They recognize each other and they have a conversation, and then the story comes out, which you had mentioned. There is a suspenseful, thrillerish kind of bent to it because there's certain beats that happen to where it's like, well, what's going to happen next? And I think that's probably where people are pulling that from. But can you talk about the origins of doing this type of story, narrator telling another person's story, and how it filters from one to the next?
Yeah. I was working on this book, um, and by this book, I mean a book that centers on Jeff, who's telling the story to the narrator. Um, Jeff rescuing somebody from the ocean, rescuing somebody who from the ocean who was drowning and who was sort of a questionable moral status. And that book, the first draft was probably 1.5 times how long the actual published novel was. And it was first person from Jeff's perspective, speaking to the reader directly. And I could never make it work to my satisfaction, right? It's like this thing happened, he rescued this guy, and the guy's questionable, and he's sort of stalking, trying to figure out who he saved. A lot of the stuff that is in Mouth to Mouth, but it wasn't satisfying to me in terms of like why does this exist, right? What is the point of this book? And I was working on another novel at the same time, or not at the same time. I was abandoning this novel to go work on another novel, and then I would abandon that novel to work on this one. Definitively abandoned. Not like I'm going to go work on this now, but total, writerly despair and like, oh God, okay, well, this is never going to work. Like my wife is very patient with this oscillation.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I've come to recognize it as a part of my process, I guess. So I try to not be as emotionally extreme about these things happening. But I was working on the other book and I was rereading Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald. And
Mhm.
Sebald uses a sort of authorial stand-in narrator who encounters this guy Jacques Austerlitz several times over the years, and it's Jacques Austerlitz's story that's being conveyed over the
Mhm.
course of the novel. Um, and I thought, well, what if I did that? Like, just my book has nothing to do with Austerlitz, and it's not even the similar style. I mean, maybe the first page has a little, you know,
Mhm.
a quintessence of that contemplative mode before we get things going. But he but so yeah, I decided to try it, and then all of a sudden it made way more sense to me. Sort of to have the telling of the story be on stage, so the reader's watching the telling of the story to the narrator, as
Mhm.
opposed to having it be directly between, unreliable narrator and the reader. So that
Mhm.
sort of space is in a different that space of unreliability is in a different zone. And uh I enjoyed the openness and ambiguity of Jeff's story all the more because, I mean, to a certain extent, I can't answer the questions that people might have about Jeff. I only know what Jeff told me, so to speak, right?
Mhm.
Um, I have my own theory of how it all went down, but uh, I enjoyed that. I don't know that the setup. It shifted the whole narrative around for me, and then made it possible for me to write it. And then in the end, uh, it felt justified. It felt like that was hopefully it's just like anything in a finished book. It feels 100% confident and authoritative, and it couldn't have been any other way.
Mhm.
But you don't ever see the process that led to that, which is fear, uncertainty, doom, and
Right.
improvisation or whatever. Yeah.
So that's very interesting because the narrator is kind of like the Greek chorus. He comments. He has his
Yeah.
own opinions. He often calls Jeff bullshit. Says I don't believe this, but he's still talking, kind of thing.
Right. Right.
And that makes it very fascinating because then I started thinking, well, is Jeff bullshitting or not? Is this, and that makes it a more interesting perspective. I imagine that Jeff in your first initial draft, was he the same Jeff? Was he the same kind of like, I don't know why this is happening, but it's happening, or was he a little different in that first iteration?
Um, that's a good question. I think because we were in his head, there's certainly like, yeah, I don't know why this is happening, but there was more maybe of an emphasis on his analysis of the situation.
Okay, yeah. So
Yeah.
he's more
Yeah.
mysterious now because he doesn't really do, I mean, when they're talking in the lounge, sometimes he'll say something, but a lot of times he's just like, I was just there. I don't,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wasn't doing anything. Stuff was just happening. And that's interesting rather than him saying, well, I'm trying to do this or trying to do that.
Well, and then in the end, I mean, in the book,
Hmm.
his silences in terms of I think mainly his own ambition is what he's silent about. It is the sort of thing that he's denying the whole time. He does not want to be seen as somebody who has craftily got himself where he is. He
Hmm.
wants to see himself as somebody who accidentally rose to the position that he's in
Right.
without darkness.
Right. Let's talk about the length of the story. It's a short novel. I don't know if
Hmm.
it's necessarily a novella, but it's hovering around that length. And I think that is an advantage to the book because once Jeff really gets into the story, it kind of ratchets up the things that he's doing, and then it doesn't hang around for so long that that tension dissipates. Was that intended to be that length?
It's one Gatsby long. I measure books in Gatsby's now. Gatsby's 48,000 something. This is about
Right.
50,000. So
Hmm.
it as I said, that earlier draft, the Jeff only draft was 1.5 times longer. And it was 75,000 words by the time I gave up, and it wasn't even near getting the end of things. So it was a more loquacious narration. And in this version, I never really, I didn't think about what the length of the book was going to be until I got there. Uh, Something that makes it short is the way that we have these scenes in real time in the airport that are slow dialogue, going to get another drink or whatever. And then, but then we can cut immediately to the most important part of the story, right?
Hmm.
And then move through that and then cut back to the airport and you can sort of skip. So, um, it turned out to be kind of a compression technique, after the fact,
Hmm.
so that there's not a so that the interstitial stuff isn't as sort of scene setty as you would get in a traditional, let's say, close third person narrative where
Hmm.
the people are pulling up in the driveway to the party before they go to the thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I love that the two came basically from the same background, well, not background, but they both came from the same college and they obviously have a very different life. And so there's a power dynamic, whether it's mentioned or not, because Jeff has access to the lounge and he invites the narrator in there. And I found that very fascinating. Can you talk about that a little bit and what your fascination was in having these two men having, different um, status, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely thought of their encounter as a sort of analog to a conversation you might have at a high school reunion, right? I mean, they're college friends. I just say high school reunion because I did go to UCLA. I've never been to a college reunion. It would be too
Hmm.
big. But in early middle age, let's call it, depending on how healthy we are, uh, I think we do look around sometimes and see some people who have become insanely successful in some form or another, and then we assess our own lives for a moment and say, sort of, where am I? How am I doing? And so the narrator is a guy who's continued to be a writer of literary fiction, and he's got his old backpack, which, I mean, if many writers would identify with this, you're still carrying the JanSport around,
Could
even
be
though
from
you're,
college still, his same
yeah,
backpack.
right. You might have you might have an adjunct teaching job or something, but
Mhm.
your bag is no different from your students' bags. And then Jeff has moved from being a guy who wore inside out free swag t-shirts to somebody who's become really wealthy. And so, yeah, I don't know. I just think it's an interesting thing to look at, um, the ways in which our attitudes toward money and success change as we get older,
Yeah, for sure.
and as we have kids too, especially.
Mm. Yeah, for sure. This is very fascinating. I guess I don't want to give away the ending, but I literally, when it's revealed in the last paragraph what he learns, I was like, of course.
Oh, good.
Right?
I,
Because there was no, I mean, I was kind of thinking at that point of like, well, this is a possibility, but I guess I still wasn't imagining that that's what it would be without giving it.
yeah. And I mean, I'm not a I don't want to write something that relies on a trick ending for its power. However, I'll say this. When I finished the first draft, I finished the penultimate chapter where Jeff is essentially getting back on the plane and he feels relieved of this story and he's walking a bit lighter. And that
Mhm.
was the end of the book. That was the end of the book that I was going toward.
Right.
And it wasn't until I had finished that chapter that I had a moment of what if? And I just wrote Berlin was a bust, and then that entire last chapter just came out of my fingers pretty much as written, including the last sentence, which just
Mm.
it just all sort of uh, flowed out in a way that these days I find pretty rare in writing. Sometimes I'll have a really find myself to a place where things really flow,
Mm.
and um, and so I guess I had to be the person who wrote the entire book before I could write that ending, before I could
Yes.
occur to me that that ending might be how it ends. And then, you know, then I was like, well, can I really end a book like this on a sort of mic drop? Um, the ideal version of it being the metaphor is you're walking through a cave with a flashlight, and then at the end you turn around and all the shadows look different, right? Looking back, suddenly,
Mm.
and or can I just do that? And I was like, well, I might, you know what? I would like to read a book like that. I'd like to read a book that doesn't have an epilogue, but just drops it on you. And then, you have to go look back. So once I stumbled across that ending or was granted that ending from the mysterious subconscious or something, I then, went back and revised the book in a number of ways to, I guess, to make those shadows I talked about
Mm.
effective rather than just sort of like a pulling the rug out from under you.
Right.
Um, so it had been there the whole time for me, and it was just a matter of making sure it would be there the whole time for the reader, as you said, your
Right.
experience that there was something there.
What's great about the ending, and it really speaks to our times, is that I feel like it's something that a lot of people would do. They'd get on Google and they'd look for some things. Whereas if they had met in the 90s and had this conversation, he wouldn't have been able to attain the information in that way. It would have been very
True.
difficult to find what he found. He'd have to be
Right.
digging microfiche in a certain location. I mean, good luck finding it, right? But now the
Right.
fact that he was like, "Oh, I'm curious," and then he found it, like we all would
Yeah.
do. That was kind of the genius of it, of like, oh, of course he would go look.
Because it's so easy. Right. He wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. He wouldn't necessarily have gone right to the research library, and we remember
Right.
those days. Yeah.
Yes, for sure. Right. Are you digging through microfiche of a paper in South Dakota or something?
Right.
Let's change gears a little bit. So what are some writing rituals that you have that kind of get you in the headspace to do what you do? Do you have any kind of recurring rituals that you perform when you're writing?
I am always looking for new ones. I'm always looking for something that'll work. And I'll tell you the most recent one, um, and I'm not sure whether it works yet, but it's exciting because it's an idea. Um, I'm working on a new novel, and what I noticed kept happening is I'll drive my daughter to school, and I drive up the hill. Their school's 20 minutes away or so.
Hmm.
Sometimes 20, 25 minutes to come back. But on the drive back, what am I doing in the car? Sometimes I listen to music, but more often, like those of us living in this era, I need to fill my head with information. I'm listening to NPR or a podcast or an audiobook.
Hmm.
And I realized then I get home, make another coffee, get into my office and sit down and expect myself to enter the world of my book, having just filled my head with a bunch of other information. And it's
Yeah.
difficult. So, what I decided to do was I downloaded this app called Natural Reader and I paste in yesterday's work. Um,
Okay.
like 20 minutes worth of text from the day before or from the
Uh-huh.
day before that or whatever. And then on the drive home, instead of listening to other stuff, I listened to the manuscript up until the point where I'm going to continue writing it. So it gives me and it reads it to me in my own voice, which is creepy but
Okay.
cool. Because it's got like an AI thing where you read a bunch of sentences and then it can imitate your own voice. So it doesn't sound it actually sounds kind of a lot like me, which is really crazy. So then I end up coming home, making the coffee, and I have a to-do list of things that didn't sound quite right or could use help from the previous day. And
Yeah.
then I'm kind of in the world of the book. So that's my current ritual attempt. It's very, as far as rituals go, it's very practical.
That's a really good idea. What's the name of the app again? So people can look into it.
Natural reader.
Natural Reader.
Yeah, Pam Houston turned me on to it. She was using it to read student manuscripts uh,
Okay.
in the midst of doing many other different things. And I was like, wow, this is kind of an uh, incredible idea. The downside to it is that sometimes I think rereading what you've just written can put you in the mindset of, I don't know, solidifying too much of that first draft stuff and making you feel like that's your final draft or something.
Hmm.
It's easy to lose confidence, I guess, is what I'm saying, because it doesn't,
Okay.
you see all the things that don't work, but you know.
Right. Yeah, I imagine hearing it back, you might get frustrated if it sounds awkward or.
Yeah, I mean, awkward is great because then you can go back and
Mhm.
fix it. It's just, am I, the bigger questions, right? Like, am I, is all this information unfolding the right way? Have I chosen the right form? Am I in the right POV, right?
Mhm.
Like, I'm doing it as a close third person and I've committed to it, and yet I'm not sure. We'll
Right.
see. Yeah.
Yeah, I like to listen to music when I'm writing, and I find now that I've done it for so long, there's only like 7 or 8 albums that I'll listen to. I've listened to them so much that they just become in the
Yeah.
background, and my brain just is like it's writing time, and I just read the last couple sentences, and then it just goes, and that's been very effective for me.
I listen to music too, and it can't be new music.
Right.
Yeah. It's the same kind of thing. And it
Hmm.
sometimes it's music so I can work somewhere not at home.
Right.
Better than sort of like white noise or whatever. If you put on, there's like an album by like Explosions in the Sky, which is fairly loud, and
Oh
punchy.
yeah.
It drowns out other sound, and I'm not caught on the notes or caught on words. I
Yeah, they're
can
great. Yeah,
concentrate.
that's a
Yeah.
band from Austin. They're fantastic. I usually
Huh.
listen to the Avalanches, which is they're electronic music, but it's also kind of there's orchestral bits in it. It's really
Hmm.
kind of weird. It's very cinematic, and so a lot of times when I get to the end of the album, my brain's done.
Nice.
You
Yeah.
know, good hour and 10 minutes, and that's it.
Yeah, that's we all measure how we get our daily writing done in different ways, right? Some people are like, I do 1,000 words, or I do 3 pages, or I work for 3 hours. I found that in the midst of busy scheduled life, family life mainly, but work also, um, the sort of pseudo Pomodoro timer thing I do is 45-minute chunks.
Mm,
And so like it's how many 45s can I get done in a
yeah.
day, you know? And then I'll text my friend and I'll be like, I got 3 45s. Like, how'd you do? Yeah.
That's a
Little
good length of time,
accountability.
45 minutes. It's like a substantial enough time to
Yeah.
get some work done. I have a day job, and the time that I write mostly is during my lunch hour.
Mm,
And there's always like a sense of urgency when I sit down. It's like I'm going to put my music on, start to drink my coffee, and I got an hour. But
right.
usually it's about 45 minutes because I need a few minutes to kind of get into the frame of mind. So that totally makes sense to me.
Yeah.
3 chunks of 45. That's great. All right. Well, now's the time in the show where we do our lightning round. It is a concept we got from inside the actor's studio, but it's not their concept. They stole it from Bernard Pivot, who stole it from Marcel Proust, and he probably stole it from another Frenchman. So, Antoine Wilson, are you ready for the lightning round?
No, I'm not. I need 5 minutes. Can we pause for a minute?
Sure.
I
All
need to
right.
contain myself.
We're going to take a
Okay.
break.
All right. Now I'm ready to start. Yes.
Okay, Antoine Wilson, are you ready
Hi.
for the lightning
I'm
round?
back.
We're
I'm
back.
back from the dead. I
Okay.
think I figured out my lightning round.
Excellent. So, what is your favorite word?
Tatterdemalion.
Excellent.
Yeah, I read it. It's in Tobias Smollett's translation of Don Quixote. I'd never
Okay.
seen it before. And it's a word that means ragamuffin,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's a better word than ragamuffin, and I'm just sad that we don't use it anymore.
I agree. What's your
Yeah.
least favorite word?
Gloaming.
Excellent.
I just feel like whenever it's used, it's just like purple, Like who needs that word? It's
A little too
pushy.
purple.
A little too pushy.
Right.
Yeah.
What turned you on?
Beautiful waves in the
Okay.
ocean. Yeah.
Nice. And then what turned you off?
Salesmanship, people trying to sell me on anything, including a version of who they are.
Yeah. I just had a book promotion guy. He's been bugging me on Instagram. It's really bugging me a lot. What's your idea of happiness?
Freedom.
Yeah. Here. Who's your
Yeah.
favorite author?
I've got a bunch, but I'm gonna go with uh, Javier Marias,
Okay.
Spanish writer. Yeah,
What's the book of his that you
I
love?
know. Um, Tomorrow in the Battle, Think on Me, which
Okay.
is a mouthful of a title, but a fantastic novel. Yeah.
Excellent. If you could be any character from a work of fiction or novel throughout history, who would that be?
This is a ridiculous one, but the narrator, I don't remember his name, of Nicholson Baker's book, The Fermata. It's a book about a guy who can stop time.
Oh,
And he does some, I mean, other, before House of Holes, it's like the probably, fairly pornographic book. But besides that creepy stuff that he does stop time and just gets extra time to read, which I would use. Yeah.
that's all right. That's a great use of your stopping time powers. All right. What profession other than your own would you want to attempt?
Um, in terms of legal professions, I think computer programmer. I
Okay.
do. I don't get very far on it, but I love taking like Code Academy courses and just learning some very basic computer programming because I love the structures and it's like writing but without the emotional content.
Mm-hmm.
Either that or sculpting. I could want to be a sculptor maybe. No words, something without words. And then if it were an illegal thing that I could do, I've always wanted to be a human smuggler, somebody who brings people into the country illegally in a
Okay.
humane way. in a humane way for for profit, but mainly just to refute the idea of international borders.
Right. So what's a
Yeah.
profession you would least want to do?
Um, uh, Probably, well, there are a lot of them, but the one that comes to mind the most that just for some reason is a reality star. Uh, yeah, I don't think I could handle, and I wouldn't want to handle being observed all the time. I'll put it that
Right.
way. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, last question. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you reach the check-in desk?
Surprise.
Ta-da.
I would be very surprised. So if he said surprise, I feel like, okay, we can get to know each other now.
Perfect.
Right.
That's right. All right, Antoine Wilson's excellent book, Mouth to Mouth. Please go out and get it. And thanks for being on our show.
It was really a pleasure. Thank you so much, Scott.
This has been a presentation of Austin Liddy Limits, made possible with help from our good friends at Blue Ink Review, where typing "the end" is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com.